The rain fell the way grief does, quiet at first, then all at once. Seattle shimmered beneath it, a city made of reflections, glass towers blurred by water, headlights scattering across slick streets, the world reduced to light and longing. Inside a charcoal gray Aston Martin parked beside a curb on Madison Street, Ethan Vale sat motionless, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping him from unraveling. He had just come from the fertility clinic. The doctor's words still echoed in the hollow of his chest. Severely impaired count. Conception without intervention. Unlikely. Such a clinical sentence for a wound so personal. At 38, Ethan Vale was the sort of man people described as unshakable. A self-made billionaire, he had built the Vale Group from a single hotel concept into an empire of glass and gold that stretched from Vancouver to Dubai. Every photograph, every headline painted him as a man who had it all: youth, wealth, power. But sitting there, staring through the raindrops melting down the windshield, he realized that all had never been the right word. He had always imagined fatherhood as an inevitability, a child running through the halls of his mother's old lake house, laughter filling the rooms where silence had taken root since her death. But fate, with its peculiar cruelty, had handed him everything except the one thing he could never buy: life. He turned off the car's engine, letting the storm swallow the sound. His reflection in the glass looked like a stranger, handsome in the polished, detached way magazines loved, but empty behind the gray of his eyes. The city outside pulsed with movement, lovers hurrying beneath umbrellas, strangers chasing late-night trains, the living proof that the world still had purpose. And yet here he sat, a man surrounded by the pulse of creation but unable to create. When the pain grew too large to contain, he reached for the glove compartment and retrieved a small velvet box. Inside, a ring glimmered beneath the dim streetlight, a diamond halo meant for Claire, the woman who had once been the dream and had since become the distance. He'd bought it years ago, before success had built walls between them, before every conversation had turned into negotiation. He opened it one last time, and for a fleeting second, he imagined her face when he would have told her about the diagnosis. He imagined her immaculate composure faltering, the perfect mask slipping to reveal what? Pity? Resentment? Relief? A sharp breath escaped him. He snapped the box shut and tucked it away. Some endings, he thought, happen long before you name them. Rain drummed harder against the roof. A siren wailed somewhere in the city. Ethan closed his eyes, resting his forehead against the steering wheel, and whispered into the darkness. What's left of a man who can build the world, but not a legacy? There was no answer, only the steady rhythm of the rain, as if the heavens themselves were trying to wash his thoughts clean. He turned the ignition again, the soft growl of the engine cutting through the storm like a heartbeat refusing to die. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he couldn't go home. Beacon Hill, where Claire waited in their sterile penthouse of marble and glass, felt like another planet. The place smelled of roses that never wilted and champagne that never ran dry. But it had no scent of warmth. He designed his life to impress everyone except himself. So he drove. Past Pike Place, where vendors were packing up flowers now drenched in silver rain. Past the neon signs reflecting in puddles like bleeding colors. The city blurred into streaks of gold and crimson, and he followed the road as if it might lead him to a version of himself worth keeping. At a red light, a bus roared by, splashing the windshield. Through the fogged glass, he saw a mural painted on the side of a nearby building, an outstretched hand holding a small, growing plant. Below it, 3 words written in bold white letters: "Some things bloom late." The message struck him with a strange, quiet force. It didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like a whisper from something larger than him, urging him to keep driving. The rain thickened, but the ache in his chest began to shift. Not ease, exactly, just change shape, the way metal bends under fire. There, in the solitude of the storm, Ethan realized that loss could be a kind of beginning, if you let it be. That sometimes, before you can receive anything new, you have to lose the illusion that you ever had control. He turned onto a smaller street, one he didn't recognize. The glow of a corner diner spilled onto the wet pavement, warm and inviting. For reasons he couldn't name, he parked across from it, his pulse slowing for the first time that night. He didn't know that just a few blocks away, another life was about to collide with his. One carrying a heartbeat he thought he'd never hear again. But destiny, like the rain, has a way of finding those who stand still too long. He exhaled and reached for his phone. The screen lit his face in pale blue, a glow that made his eyes look tired, human. On the lock screen, a quote he'd saved years ago stared back at him. "The universe only takes from you what it plans to replace." For the first time that evening, Ethan allowed himself a faint smile, fragile, almost imperceptible. Maybe, he thought, something was coming to replace what he'd lost. Maybe not a child, maybe not a legacy, but perhaps something living, something true. Outside, the rain softened to a drizzle, as if giving him permission to breathe again. He leaned back in his seat, watching the drops trail down the glass like tears finally spent. And though he didn't know it yet, that small act of surrender, the decision to keep driving instead of giving up, was the first note in a symphony that had been waiting for him all along. He whispered to the quiet car, as if to someone listening far beyond the rain, "If you can hear this story, stay with me. There's more to come." Sometimes the heart just needs to be reminded that even broken things can still find their rhythm. And somewhere beyond the storm, another heart was already waiting to meet his. If this story touched something inside you, let your voice echo back. Leave a thought, a heart, or even just a "I'm here." Every word you share keeps this story alive, and every listener turns this space into a family. Follow along. The rain is only beginning to fall. The storm had turned the city into a blur of trembling lights and silver noise. Rain lashed against the rooftops, slid down lampposts, and pooled in the uneven cracks of forgotten streets. Somewhere between midnight and mercy, Amara Lewis was running. Each step splashed through shallow water, her soaked sneakers slapping the pavement, her breath sharp and uneven. The air smelled of asphalt and coming thunder. She pressed a trembling hand against the wall to steady herself, her other arm wrapped around the swell of her belly. It was too soon. A contraction tore through her, sudden and brutal, leaving her gasping. She had felt the first warning earlier that evening while finishing her shift at the community clinic. A dull ache, easily ignored. But now the pain came in waves, stronger, closer. The twins were not supposed to arrive for another 5 weeks. Her doctor had warned her about stress, about rest, about taking care of herself. But how could she rest when life had given her no safe place to land? The clinic's old neon sign flickered behind her. 24-hour care, the letters stuttering in the rain like a dying heartbeat. Inside, the last nurse had locked up half an hour ago. Amara had been that nurse. She'd finished her charts, wiped down the counters, and turned off the lights before realizing that the cramps twisting through her abdomen weren't the usual fatigue. She had locked the door, stepped into the storm, and told herself she could make it to the hospital on her own. Now, leaning against the cold brick, she wasn't so sure. Her vision blurred, the street lamps smeared into halos. Every breath felt like a fight. Somewhere in the distance, a car engine hummed, a low, steady rhythm cutting through the chaos. And then, the world tilted. Her knees hit the sidewalk hard. She caught herself with her hands, water splashing up her arms. Her hair, once a crown of soft black curls, clung to her face. Somewhere beneath the pain and the fear, she felt the faint, steady kick of life inside her. 2 small hearts beating against her own. "Not now," she whispered, half to herself, half to them. "Please, not like this." Headlights flared around the corner, slicing through the rain. The sleek shape of a car slowed, then stopped. The door opened. Footsteps splashed closer, sure, determined, out of place in this forgotten part of the city. "Hey!" a voice said, low and urgent. Are you all right? She turned her head, blinking through the rain. The man was tall, sharply dressed, his coat already soaked. His face was both striking and gentle, shadowed by the city lights. His eyes, gray, maybe blue, it was hard to tell, were filled with concern rather than curiosity. I'm fine, she managed, though the lie broke apart on her tongue as another contraction took her breath away. You're not fine, he said softly. He knelt beside her, his voice steady in the storm. You're in labor, aren't you? Amara wanted to protest, to tell him she didn't need his help, that she could handle this. But pride had its limits, and pain was a ruthless truth-teller. She nodded, her face tightening. All right, he said. We're going to get you to a hospital. Can you stand? She shook her head, shivering. No money, she whispered. The clinic, they don't... He didn't let her finish. Then I'll cover it. Her eyes flicked to him in disbelief. The rain made it hard to focus, but she could see the details that didn't belong here. The tailored coat, the expensive watch, the quiet command in his tone. Men like this didn't stop on empty streets to help strangers. Why are you helping me? She asked, her voice breaking. His answer came without hesitation. Because you need someone. And before she could protest again, he scooped her into his arms. She gasped as he lifted her, startled by the strength that felt effortless, by the warmth that contrasted with the storm around them. Her head fell against his shoulder. His scent was clean, like rain on stone. The world blurred into motion, the open car door, the rush of heat from the interior, the distant thrum of thunder. Inside the car, he laid her gently across the seat and fastened the belt with careful precision. The leather was cool against her skin, her soaked clothes sticking uncomfortably, but the sound of the engine rumbling to life gave her a fragile sense of safety. I'm Ethan, he said as he pulled into the street. His voice was calm, measured, the kind of voice you believe without knowing why. Amara, she breathed. All right, Amara, you're safe now. Just keep breathing. We'll be there soon. The city flashed by in streaks of light, storefronts, bridges, endless rain. Every so often he glanced toward her, his jaw tight with focus. She watched the profile of his face, the furrow in his brow, the veins that stood out on his hands gripping the wheel. He didn't look away when she cried out in pain. He only spoke softer. You're doing good, he murmured. Just breathe through it. His calm wrapped around her like a blanket. Between contractions, her thoughts began to drift. Who was he? What would possess a man like this? A stranger in an expensive car, to stop for her, to care. The last man who'd promised to protect her had walked out the moment she told him she was pregnant. Her mind flashed to Derek's face, his cold laughter, the words that had broken her. You and those kids will only drag me down. Another contraction hit. She gripped the door handle, teeth clenched, tears spilling. They're twins, she gasped. He nodded once, as if that explained everything. Then we better get there faster. He pressed harder on the accelerator, weaving through near-empty streets. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Amara felt something other than fear. She felt absurdly, impossibly safe. When the hospital's lights finally appeared through the curtain of rain, she let out a sound that was half sob, half laughter. Ethan pulled into the emergency bay, braked hard, and was out of the car before she could move. Moments later, she was in his arms again, carried through sliding doors into a rush of white light and sterile air. Nurses hurried forward, voices overlapping in brisk commands. How far apart are the contractions? 2 minutes. Twins. Prep delivery. Ethan hesitated at the doorway as they wheeled her away. She reached for his hand instinctively, fingers catching his for just a second. Their eyes met, hers wide with fear, his steady with something deeper, something unspoken. And in that brief touch, something shifted. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't obligation. It was recognition. Like two lost souls brushing against the edges of the same broken map. Don't leave, she whispered. He didn't. Outside, the rain began to fade into mist, as if the sky itself were holding its breath for what came next. Inside, somewhere down the sterile corridor, the cries of newborn life would soon echo, and the man who thought he could never create life was about to discover that destiny sometimes finds its own way to deliver a miracle. The storm did not end that night, it only changed its voice. Outside, thunder rolled across the city like an ancient drum, shaking glass and heartbeats alike. Inside the hospital, the light was too bright, the air too cold, and yet everything pulsed with a quiet urgency, as though time itself had narrowed to this one fragile moment. Ethan Vale stood in the hallway outside the delivery room, rainwater still clinging to his coat, his hair damp against his forehead. The world around him blurred in motion, nurses rushing, doors swinging, the faint metallic clatter of instruments. He felt suspended between two worlds. One he understood, built of logic and control, and another he had never entered, the world of beginnings. Through the narrow glass panel of the door, he caught glimpses of Amara. Her face glistened with sweat, her curls plastered to her skin. She was gripping the side rails of the hospital bed, her voice breaking as she fought against the rhythm of pain. But her eyes, when they opened, burned with something unyielding, fierce, almost holy. He had seen strength before, in boardrooms, in negotiations, in survival. But this was different. This was life wrestling its way through flesh and will. He pressed a hand to the glass without realizing it. Somewhere deep inside, something in him cracked open. A silence he hadn't known he'd been living inside of. A nurse stepped out, her face brisk but kind. "Are you the father?" The question hit him like lightning. He blinked. "No," he said softly. "Just someone who found her." The nurse nodded. "She's early. Twins can be unpredictable, but she's strong. They're both fighting." Fighting. The words settled into his chest like an ember. He nodded, but his voice failed him. Minutes stretched into hours. He lost all sense of time, pacing between vending machines and sterile walls. Every sound became heightened. The rain against the windows, the echo of footsteps, the muffled cries from behind closed doors. He hadn't prayed in years, but he found himself whispering to the air, to whatever might be listening, "Let them be safe. Let her be safe." When the nurse returned again, her mask couldn't hide the faint curve of a smile. "She wants you in there." He froze. "Me?" "She said you kept her breathing in the car. She doesn't want to do the rest of this without you." His throat tightened. He nodded, handed the nurse his coat, and pushed through the door. The sound hit him first, the rhythmic, desperate breath of someone fighting both fear and destiny. Machines beeped softly. Rainwater from his shoes darkened the tile. Amara turned her head toward him, her eyes glassy with exhaustion, but focused on him as if he were the only steady thing in the room. "You came," she whispered. He moved closer, uncertain, reverent. "You asked me to." She tried to smile, but another contraction took her. Her grip found his hand, crushing and trembling all at once. He held on without hesitation. "You're doing beautifully," he murmured, not sure where the words came from, only that she needed them. "You're almost there." The doctor gave instructions. Nurses moved with choreography born of urgency, and Ethan stood in the middle of it all, feeling utterly powerless and yet more alive than he'd been in years. And then it happened. A cry. Small, raw, defiant. The sound of a universe being rewritten. The first twin arrived, a girl, her skin glistening under the harsh light, her voice trembling but strong. Ethan felt something collapse inside him. He had imagined birth before, abstractly, like a concept, but hearing that sound was like being struck by truth itself. Tears he didn't expect filled his eyes. Amara reached out weakly. "Is she okay?" "She's perfect," the nurse said, laying the newborn against her chest. Ethan watched as Amara's trembling fingers brushed the baby's cheek. The sight undid him. There, in that sterile, overlit room, love took physical shape, small, wrinkled, infinite. But the moment was not finished. Second one's coming, the doctor said. Amara's breath hitched. Ethan squeezed her hand again, felt her strength return through sheer will. The air thickened with tension. Minutes passed like centuries, and then another cry. Softer this time, but sure. A boy. Twins, the doctor's voice softened. You did it. Amara's tears mixed with sweat as both babies were placed beside her. She looked from them to Ethan, her lips trembling into something between disbelief and awe. They're really here. He knelt beside her, unable to speak. The girl's tiny hand opened and closed against her mother's chest. The boy yawned, a small, perfect sound. They're beautiful, he whispered. She laughed through her tears, the sound fragile but bright. You sound surprised. I am, he said. Not by them, by this, by how much it matters. Amara turned her head toward him. You've never had children? He shook his head. I can't. The words slipped out before he could stop them, heavy but unashamed. She studied him, her expression softening, not pity, but understanding. Then maybe, she said quietly, you were meant to be here tonight for a reason. He couldn't argue. The rain outside began to soften, its anger spent. The thunder rolled away into distant memory. Inside, the room was filled with the sound of small breaths and new beginnings. Hours later, when the nurses had finished their checks and the lights dimmed, Ethan sat in the chair beside Amara's bed. She had drifted into a light sleep, the twins nestled against her. The glow from the monitor painted the three of them in a pale, ethereal light. He leaned back, exhausted but unwilling to leave. His eyes kept returning to the tiny hands, the rise and fall of two small chests, the quiet strength of the woman who had brought them into the world. He thought of the doctor's words earlier that day, of everything he'd lost, and realized how little it meant in the face of this. Maybe creation didn't always belong to those who shared blood. Maybe sometimes it belonged to those who showed up when it mattered most. Ethan closed his eyes and listened, not to the machines, not to the rain, but to the soft chorus of breath that now filled the room. For the first time in years, he felt the faint hum of purpose, delicate and pure, like the moment before dawn when the world holds its breath. He smiled faintly, whispering into the quiet, "Welcome to the world, little miracles." And though he couldn't explain why, it felt as if the universe had finally answered a prayer he hadn't dared to speak aloud. Morning came softly, as though even the sun knew the world had changed. The storm had passed, leaving the sky rinsed and pale, and the city, soaked and glittering, seemed reborn. In the quiet of the hospital room, warmth replaced the sterile chill of night. Machines hummed faintly, and two newborn hearts beat in gentle rhythm beside their mother. Amara Lewis awoke to the fragile light of dawn. Her body ached with exhaustion, yet a peace she hadn't felt in years wrapped itself around her. The twins slept soundly in the bassinets beside her bed. Tiny faces turned toward one another, their breaths shallow and synchronized, like a secret only they shared. Ethan Vale sat in the corner, still in the same clothes from the night before. His tie hung loose, his hair a little disheveled. In his lap rested a cup of untouched coffee, now gone cold. He had meant to leave, to let the professionals take over, but something in him refused to go. When Amara stirred, he stood immediately, setting the cup aside. "You should rest," he said softly, his voice low and roughened by fatigue. She blinked at him, disoriented for a moment, then recognition softened her gaze. "You stayed." "I wasn't sure I could leave," he admitted, almost to himself. "Not after that." Her lips curved faintly. "You make it sound like you were the one who gave birth." He chuckled, the sound short but genuine. "I think I aged a decade in those hours." Silence settled between them, gentle, not awkward. It was the silence of two people who had witnessed something extraordinary together and no longer needed words to prove it. Amara shifted carefully, wincing as she did. "The doctor said we can't stay long," she murmured. "Insurance doesn't cover more than one night. I'll I'll figure something out. Ethan frowned. Figure what out? Where to go next, she said simply. The shelter near Columbia Street has room sometimes. It's not ideal, but she trailed off, her voice steady but thin. The kind of steadiness born from years of having no choice but to endure. Ethan's chest tightened. He looked at the two bassinets, at the tiny lives wrapped in soft hospital blankets, their entire futures hanging on the fragile courage of a single woman. He thought of his own house, silent, vast, and empty enough to echo. Amara, he began, hesitant, almost unsure how to shape the thought that had been forming since dawn. I have a place. It's quiet, safe. It's outside the city, near the lake. She looked at him warily. You mean your home? He nodded. It belonged to my mother before she passed. There's a guest house. It's been empty for years. You could stay there for a while, just until you get on your feet. Her expression flickered between disbelief and suspicion. You're offering a house to someone you met last night in the rain, he smiled faintly. Technically, I'm offering a roof, and perhaps a chance to rest. Amara shook her head. I can't accept that. You don't even know me. I know enough, he said quietly. I know you risked your life for two others. I know you're strong enough to survive a storm, and I know that no one deserves to leave a hospital with nowhere to go. She looked away, jaw tightening. Pride and gratitude warred in her eyes. People don't do things like that without wanting something in return. I don't, he said simply. At least, not what you think. Her gaze returned to him, studying him carefully, as if waiting for the truth to reveal itself. There was no arrogance in his tone, no hidden motive she could sense. Just a man who looked tired of standing in rooms that felt too big. I can't just take charity, she whispered. Then don't, he said. Consider it work. The property needs attention. The gardens, the mail, small things. I've neglected it for too long. Her brows lifted slightly. So you're offering me a job? If it makes you more comfortable, yes. She exhaled, torn between logic and the strange pull of trust she felt around him. Everything in her life had taught her to run from generosity. It always carried a price. And yet, looking at him now, she sensed something unspoken, a loneliness that mirrored her own. I don't know, she murmured. It sounds too kind to be real. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that seemed more sorrow than joy. Then maybe it's time something kind was real. A soft cry from the bassinets broke the silence. Amara reached for the babies, instinctively calming them with gentle words. Ethan watched her hands, steady and graceful, even in exhaustion. The tenderness in her movements, the quiet strength of her voice, it stirred something deep in him, something ancient and wordless. He hadn't realized until that moment how starved he'd been for the sight of care that wasn't transactional, for a love that asked for nothing in return. When she finally looked up again, he said, You don't have to decide now, just think about it. I'll have my driver bring some things by later today. Food, diapers, whatever you need. Amara opened her mouth to refuse, but the protest faded. She was too tired, too overwhelmed by the avalanche of kindness she didn't know how to hold. Why are you doing this, Ethan? She asked softly. He hesitated, his voice lower now, almost reverent. Because sometimes life gives you a second chance in a way you don't expect. Last night I thought I'd lost the right to ever be near something new, something alive. But when I saw them, he nodded toward the twins, I realized maybe the world hadn't given up on me yet. Amara's eyes softened. You talk like someone who's been waiting for a long time. He met her gaze. Maybe I have. The room fell into a hush again, filled only by the rhythmic breaths of the sleeping newborns. Outside the window, the morning light caught on the glass, scattering into soft gold across the walls. Ethan turned to leave, stopping at the doorway. If you change your mind, he said, the lake house is always open. After he was gone, Amara stared at the space he had occupied. The air still held his presence, a quiet steadiness that felt impossible to mistrust. She looked down at her children, their tiny fingers curling against one another, and whispered, Maybe, for once, we don't have to run. Outside, the rain began again. Not harsh this time, but soft, like the memory of a storm learning how to forgive. And in that sound, somewhere between fear and faith, Amara began to believe that perhaps this meeting, born of accident and rain, was no accident at all. The first thing Amara noticed about the Vale Lake estate was the silence. Not the kind of silence that felt empty, but the kind that seemed to listen. The hush of wind through pine, the soft sigh of water against stone, the faint hum of a place that had been waiting too long to be lived in again. The drive from Seattle had been long and curving, the road narrowing as it wound past cedar groves and fog-laced hills. By the time Ethan's car turned onto the private lane, the world behind them felt distant, blurred into memory. The estate revealed itself slowly, as though reluctant to be seen. A glass and cedar house standing at the water's edge, its windows reflecting the silver surface of the lake. "It's beautiful," Amara murmured when the car stopped. Ethan glanced out through the windshield, his expression unreadable. "It used to be," he said quietly. "It will be again." She turned to look at him, but he was already stepping out, his figure framed against the mist rising off the lake. For a moment, she saw not the billionaire who had appeared out of nowhere, but a man haunted by something unseen. A memory, perhaps, or a promise left unfinished. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and dust, though sunlight was already beginning to chase away the shadows. The architecture was all clean lines and open space, wide glass walls that dissolved the boundary between inside and out, pale oak floors that glowed beneath her steps. Yet beneath the elegance, there was a lingering melancholy, like a piano left mid-song. Ethan led her through the rooms with quiet reverence, pointing out small things as if introducing her to something he loved, but didn't know how to claim. "This was my mother's reading room. She loved mornings by the window. You can see the fog lift over the lake from here." Amara paused, looking out at the pale shimmer of water through the glass. "It feels peaceful," she said. "She used to say peace was just another form of courage," he replied softly. "She believed you had to fight to keep it." They moved through the kitchen, spacious, modern, but uninhabited, and down a hallway that opened into the guest house. "This will be yours," Ethan said, holding the door open for her. The space was smaller, simpler, a single bedroom, a kitchenette, and a large window overlooking the lake. The air was cooler here, touched by the scent of rain and pine. Amara stood at the window for a long moment, watching ripples spread across the water. "This doesn't feel like a house," she said at last. "It feels like a pause between heartbeats." Ethan looked at her, as if startled by the accuracy of her words. "That's exactly what it's been." He left soon after, giving her time to settle. The driver carried in boxes, diapers, food, clean linens, and left quietly. Amara worked in silence, arranging what little she owned alongside what had been provided. The twins slept soundly in their cribs by the window, the rhythmic sound of the lake lulling them into peace. By late afternoon, the sun broke through the clouds, scattering gold across the water. Amara stepped outside, barefoot on the wooden deck. The air was crisp, the lake so still it mirrored the sky. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about escape routes or backup plans. For the first time, she could breathe without flinching. She was still standing there when a soft voice startled her. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Amara turned to see an older woman approaching along the path that wound through the gardens. She wore a light shawl and carried a basket of herbs. Her hair was silver, but her eyes were sharp and warm. "I'm Margaret Hensley," she said with a kind smile. "Caretaker, cook, occasional gardener. I've been here since Ethan was a boy." "Amara Lewis," she replied, shaking her hand gently. "I know," Margaret said, her smile deepening. "He called this morning, told me we'd be having new life in the house. You and your little ones." Something in her tone, neither curiosity nor judgment, only welcome, made Amara's chest tighten. "I hope it's not too much trouble." "Trouble?" Margaret laughed softly. "Child, this place has been too quiet for too long. The walls have been starving for laughter. That evening, Margaret brought dinner to the guest house. A simple stew, warm bread, chamomile tea. Amara ate slowly, savoring the comfort. Through the window, the last light of day stretched across the water, and the house beyond looked softer somehow, as if the presence of life had already begun to change it. When the twins finally fell asleep, she stepped outside again. Across the yard, lights glowed from the main house. Through one of the windows, she could see Ethan seated at a piano. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable, but his hands moved with quiet grace. The melody was slow, contemplative, rippling through the night like the reflection of rain on glass. Amara stood there in the dark, listening. It wasn't the music of performance. It was the sound of someone remembering how to feel. Later, when she returned inside, she lay beside her children and whispered, "Maybe this is what healing sounds like." Days passed softly, marked by the rhythm of small tasks. Amara cleaned the garden paths, sorted mail, and learned the patterns of the house, the way the light fell through the trees in the morning, the way mist rose from the water at dusk. She would sometimes see Ethan at a distance, walking along the lake or reading in the sunroom. Their exchanges were polite, quiet, yet threaded with something unspoken. He didn't intrude, but he was always near, helping fix the loose shutter on her porch, leaving fresh flowers on the table, asking gently about the twins. One afternoon, as she hung laundry by the water, she saw him standing a few paces away, his hands in his pockets. "They seem happy," he said, nodding toward the twins asleep in their stroller. "They don't know they're supposed to be anything else," she replied with a small smile. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time, she saw the weight in his eyes not as coldness, but as sorrow he hadn't yet learned to let go of. "You brought something back here," he said quietly. "Something I thought was gone." She turned toward the lake, her voice soft but sure. Maybe it wasn't gone. Maybe it was just waiting for someone to see it again. For a long moment, they stood side by side, the air between them filled with the quiet sound of wind and water. Neither spoke again. There was no need. The lake said enough for both of them. An endless mirror of light and shadow, of beginnings that felt like endings, and endings that disguised themselves as hope. And as dusk settled over the water, Amara realized that the storm, which had once nearly taken her life, had in some strange and tender way delivered her to it. The lake had a language of its own. It whispered in the mornings and sighed at dusk, as if it too understood the art of keeping secrets. For weeks, life at the Vale estate moved in that rhythm, gentle, deliberate, and strangely suspended, as though time itself had slowed to listen. Amara began to rebuild her days piece by piece, like a bird collecting fragments to make a nest. Dawn found her in the kitchen, sunlight spilling through the wide glass windows, while the twins stirred softly in their cribs. She learned the creaks of the house, the hum of the old refrigerator, the way the floors seemed to breathe beneath her feet. There was comfort in the repetition, feedings, lullabies, the scent of coffee and pine drifting through the air. Ethan often worked from his study upstairs. Through the open window, Amara sometimes heard the low murmur of his voice on business calls, or the faint scratch of a pen against paper. He moved with quiet precision, always controlled, yet there was something different about him now, something less guarded, as if the storm that had once lived inside him had learned to sleep. Every afternoon, when the babies napped, Amara would step outside to the gardens. She had begun tending them herself, pulling weeds, restoring forgotten corners of color. Margaret would sometimes join her, a pair of gloves tucked into her apron, and a story always waiting on her tongue. "That bed near the willow used to be her favorite," Margaret said one day, handing Amara a trowel. Her? Ethan's mother. She planted roses there every spring, said they bloomed best when someone sang to them. Amara smiled faintly. "Did he ever sing?" Margaret chuckled. "Lord, no. The boy barely spoke after she passed. But he played. That piano of his. He used to sit there for hours. Some nights he still does. You can tell when the music changes. The sad notes always mean he's remembering her. Amara turned toward the main house, where sunlight glinted off the tall windows. He carries a lot. Margaret looked at her knowingly. He carries it too quietly. Maybe that's why he brought you here. Some houses need noise again before they can breathe. As days turned to weeks, the uneasy beginnings of companionship grew between them. Ethan would sometimes join her and the twins on the porch, sitting with a cup of tea as she told stories about the hospital or about growing up in Georgia. He didn't speak much, but when he listened, it was with a kind of reverence, as though every word she spoke rewrote something in him he hadn't realized was broken. One evening, he came down from his study carrying a small bundle wrapped in velvet. "I found something I thought you might like," he said. Inside the cloth lay a camera, an old Leica, its leather worn smooth with time. "It was my mother's," he said. She believed that every beginning deserved to be remembered. Amara traced her fingers over the cool metal. "It's beautiful. She used it to photograph the lake in every season. I thought maybe you could use it for them." "The twins?" He nodded. "You should have something to look back on, proof of where you started." Her throat tightened. "Ethan, I don't know how to thank you." "Don't," he said quietly. "Just take the pictures." She did. That night she captured the twins asleep together, tiny fingers intertwined like vines. In another frame, Margaret stood at the window, bathed in amber light. And later, when the world had gone still, she lifted the camera toward the main house and caught Ethan at the piano, his silhouette framed in gold. The music drifted across the lake, slow, melancholic, achingly human. In those weeks, something unspoken began to take root between them. It wasn't romance, not yet, at least not the kind that announces itself. It was smaller, quieter, the steady pulse of trust. One morning, as she was hanging laundry by the water, Ethan came to stand beside her. "You've done something to this place," he said softly. She turned, startled. "What do you mean?" "It feels alive again." Amara smiled, her eyes following the ripple of the lake. "Maybe it just needed to be seen." He nodded, and for a long moment they stood in companionable silence. The wind lifted strands of her hair, brushing them across her face. Without thinking, he reached out and tucked them behind her ear. His touch was brief, almost hesitant, but it lingered in the space between them like a question neither dared to ask. Later that afternoon, as the sky began to fade, a storm threatened once more on the horizon. The light dimmed, the air thick with electricity. The twins fussed, sensing the shift in the air, and Amara moved quickly to bring them inside. But by the time she reached the steps, Ethan was there, taking the stroller from her hands. "Go," he said gently. "I'll get the rest." She wanted to protest, but his voice carried the quiet firmness of someone who knew how to shoulder things for others. She watched from the doorway as he secured the garden chairs, the wind tossing his hair, his shirt clinging damply to his skin. The storm broke, sudden and violent, rain slashing against glass and wood. When he finally came inside, dripping and breathless, they both laughed, an unguarded, effortless sound that felt like sunlight breaking through thunderclouds. "I forgot what real storms feel like," he said, shaking the rain from his hair. "They always look worse from the outside," she replied, handing him a towel. "Once you're in them, you just keep moving." He looked at her for a long moment, the towel forgotten in his hands. "You say that like you've lived it." "I have," she said quietly, "more than once." Their eyes held, and for the first time, she saw not the polished surface of his composure, but the tender, uncertain heart beneath it. When the storm finally eased, the two of them stood by the window, watching the lake settle back into calm. The reflection of lightning flickered across the water, fading slowly into darkness. Amara thought of how fragile this peace was, how easily it could be broken, how desperately she wanted it to last. But for now, the house was warm, the twins slept soundly, and Ethan's quiet presence felt less like intrusion and more like belonging. Outside, the moon rose between drifting clouds, laying a silver path across the lake. She watched its reflection tremble with every ripple, thinking how love, too, often begins that way. Not as a fire or a storm, but as a fragile shimmer that dares to hold steady even when the wind begins to rise. The lake house had begun to breathe again. Each morning carried the rhythm of soft beginnings, sunlight on wet grass, the faint stir of wind through the open windows, the murmured song of two infants finding their own small voices. It was peace, but not the silent kind. It was the kind that pulsed quietly beneath the surface, fragile, alive. Ethan found himself drawn to that quiet. He would linger longer at breakfast, listening to Amara hum to the twins as she fed them in the sunroom. Her voice, low, untrained, but pure, wrapped itself around the space like smoke curling from a candle's flame. It was the sort of sound that turned an ordinary morning into something sacred. He had started working from home more often. His assistant sent documents to his inbox, meetings became phone calls, and the world beyond the lake began to fade into the distance. Here, life moved at the pace of heartbeats and laughter. Here, he was not a man defined by loss, but by the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being near something whole. But at night, when the house grew still, the old ache would return. The piano in the great room waited for him like a confession unspoken. It had belonged to his mother, a grand Blüthner in polished walnut, its keys slightly worn by years of touch. Ethan had avoided it for a long time, the way one avoids a memory that hurts too beautifully to revisit. But one night, when sleep refused him, he found himself standing before it, his reflection fractured across the glossy surface. He sat down and let his fingers rest on the keys. At first nothing, then a single note, another, and soon a melody began to unfold, slow, deliberate, trembling with restraint. It was not a song of sorrow nor of joy. It was something in between, the sound of a heart relearning how to speak. Outside, the rain had started again, faint and persistent. Each drop against the window seemed to echo the rhythm of his playing, blurring the line between the storm and the song. Upstairs, Amara stirred. She had grown accustomed to the quiet nights, the soft hum of monitors beside the twins' cribs, the sigh of wind against glass. But tonight the music reached her like a voice calling from another lifetime. She sat up, listening. It wasn't just the melody that drew her, it was the ache within it. Something in those notes felt familiar, as though he were playing her story without ever having heard it. She slipped on her robe and padded barefoot down the hallway, her steps barely touching the wood. The house was dim, lit only by the faint amber glow of the fireplace. Ethan didn't hear her enter. He was lost in the music, his body swaying slightly with each phrase, the sound wrapping around him like forgiveness. Amara stood in the doorway, silent. For a long moment she simply watched him, the strength in his shoulders, the tenderness in his hands, the vulnerability that filled the space between each note. When the final chord faded, she spoke. "You play like someone who's mourning and dreaming at the same time." He turned, startled, then smiled faintly. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," she said, stepping closer. "It's beautiful." He looked down at the keys, tracing one lightly. "I haven't played for anyone in years." "Why?" "Because music remembers," he said quietly. "And I've spent a long time trying to forget." She came to stand beside the piano, her eyes drawn to the photograph that rested atop it. A woman with kind eyes and a serene smile. "Your mother?" He nodded. "She taught me everything I know about sound, about stillness too." Amara studied the image. She must have been proud. A flicker of pain crossed his face. She was, until she wasn't here to be. Silence settled between them. It was the kind of silence that didn't demand to be filled. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming softly against the glass. And somewhere deep in the lake, thunder rumbled like a heartbeat too large for the sky. Amara brushed her fingertips across the edge of the piano, the gesture small but reverent. "Do you ever write your own music?" "I used to," he said, "before the company, before everything else." Maybe you should again. He glanced up at her, surprised. Why? Because sometimes, she said softly, the only way to stop carrying pain is to turn it into something that can be heard. He let her words linger in the air. Then, without speaking, he shifted slightly and gestured toward the empty side of the bench. Sit, he said. Amara hesitated. I don't know how to play. Then just listen. She sat beside him, careful, close enough to feel the warmth from his arm. He began to play again, slower this time, shaping a melody that seemed to build itself around her presence. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to be still. Not a nurse, not a mother, not a survivor, just a woman, breathing beside a man who understood what it meant to be broken, and still remained gentle. When the music stopped, the silence that followed was different, charged, alive. Ethan turned to her. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, something fragile and inevitable. It wasn't a declaration, nor even a promise. It was simply recognition, the understanding that whatever had begun between them was no longer just coincidence. She rose slowly. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For reminding me what beauty sounds like. And then she was gone, her figure dissolving into the soft glow of the hallway. Ethan sat for a long while, staring at the space where she had been. The fire had burned low, the rain had softened to a whisper, and the keys beneath his hands were still warm from the song they had shared. He pressed one final note, letting it fade into the quiet, and realized that somewhere between the grief and the stillness, Amara Lewis had become the melody he hadn't known he'd been waiting to write. Upstairs, Amara returned to her room, her heart unsettled. The twins slept peacefully, unaware of the storm that had begun, not outside, but within her. She lay beside them, eyes open to the darkness, the faint echo of the piano lingering in her mind. It wasn't just music, she realized. It was something deeper, something that had reached into the space where her fear used to live, and filled it with light. The storm had rolled in quietly, its gray weight pressing low over the lake until the horizon disappeared. The air smelled of electricity and pine. Even the water seemed to hold its breath. Inside the house, soft light flickered from the fireplace, and the world beyond the windows was reduced to shadows and rain. Amara had spent the evening putting the twins to sleep. The air in the guest house felt close, humming faintly with the storm. When she stepped outside to draw the curtains, a flash of lightning illuminated the lake, and across the water, in the main house, she saw it. A thin line of light glowing from the piano room. He was playing again. The sound reached her through the rain, a muted melody carried by the wind. It wasn't the mournful tone she had first heard that night weeks ago. This one was softer, yearning, as if he were coaxing memory into something new. She hesitated only a moment before crossing the yard. Her robe clung to her in the damp air, her bare feet whispering against the wooden steps. When she opened the door, warmth enveloped her. Firelight, the faint scent of cedar and coffee, the music wrapping around her like a heartbeat. Ethan looked up from the piano, surprised but not startled. You're not asleep. I couldn't, she said, her voice low. The storm, it makes everything louder. He nodded, his fingers lingering on the keys. Then we're the same. She stepped closer, the firelight catching the gold in her eyes. What are you playing? I don't know, he admitted. It started as something familiar. Now it's becoming something else. She smiled faintly. Maybe that's what happens when you let yourself feel again. He didn't respond right away. The rain thickened against the windows, a steady percussion to the fragile melody still echoing through the room. You make it sound easy, he said. It's not, she replied softly. But it's worth it. For a while, neither spoke. The fire snapped, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the trees, and in the small, intimate silence between them, time seemed to still. Ethan rose from the bench. There's something about storms, he said. They remind you that the world keeps moving, no matter how much you want it to stop. Amara's gaze followed him. Or maybe they remind us that we can survive the noise. He smiled at that, one of those rare, unguarded smiles that reached his eyes. Then with a kind of quiet daring, he extended his hand. "Dance with me." The words hung in the air between them. She hesitated. "Ethan." "No expectations," he said gently. "Just the music. Just this moment." Her heart beat faster. She looked at his hand, steady, open, waiting, and then at the man before her. The storm-lit eyes, the quiet strength in his posture, the sadness that had begun to soften into something tender. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. He drew her closer, his palm warm against the small of her back. The piano's melody had faded, but he hummed softly, an improvised rhythm that matched the rain. Their bodies moved tentatively at first, learning the shape of one another's presence. The fire painted their silhouettes in gold. The world outside dissolved into water and wind, but within the walls of the room, the only sound was the rustle of fabric, the soft pattern of breath. Amara's head came to rest against his shoulder. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to relax into someone's arms. She could feel his heart beneath her cheek, steady, strong, human. He smelled of rain and wood smoke, and something faintly bittersweet, like the memory of comfort. "Why are you always so gentle with me?" she whispered. "Because you've already survived enough storms," he said. Her throat tightened. The simplicity of it undid her. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not with pity, not with admiration, but with truth. They swayed together for what felt like a long time, moving without rhythm, guided only by instinct. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes shimmered with reflected firelight. "You don't have to save me," she said quietly. "I'm not trying to," he replied. "You don't need saving. You just needed a place to land." The words brushed something deep inside her, something she'd buried long ago. She stepped back slightly, studying him. "And what about you, Ethan Vale? What did you need?" He hesitated. The room crackled softly as the fire shifted, shadows playing over his face. "To remember what it feels like to care about something real," he said at last. Amara's pulse stilled. There it was, the confession she hadn't expected, simple and devastating. "I told myself I was fine being alone," he continued, voice barely above a whisper. "That the world was easier to manage when you built walls around it. But then you came in out of the rain, and suddenly those walls felt wrong, like I'd mistaken silence for peace." She drew in a shaky breath. "Ethan." He stepped closer again, his hand lifting to brush a damp curl from her cheek. The touch was reverent, hesitant. "You changed this place," he murmured. "You changed me." The words hung between them, trembling like the air before lightning. Amara felt tears sting her eyes. "You don't know me well enough to say that." "I know enough," he said. "I know that the first night I saw you, holding life in your arms while the world fell apart, I felt something I hadn't felt in years." His voice broke slightly. "Hope." The rain beat harder against the windows. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not the polished man the world admired, but the one who had carried too much and finally dared to put it down. Her hand found his again, almost without thinking. "Hope can be dangerous," she whispered. "So can loneliness," he replied. And then, without another word, he kissed her. It wasn't desperate or hurried. It was the kind of kiss that feels like an answer to a question neither had dared to ask aloud. His hand curved along her jaw. Her fingers found the back of his neck. The rain softened, the fire dimmed, and the whole world seemed to lean in, listening. When they parted, both of them stood in the hush that followed, their breaths mingling in the flicker of light. Outside, the storm began to fade, its fury spent. The first faint glow of dawn edged the clouds above the lake. Amara closed her eyes and whispered, "This feels impossible." Ethan smiled, a quiet, weary, radiant thing. "Then let's be impossible." And as the thunder retreated into the distance, the lake lay still once more, its surface reflecting not the storm that had passed, but the fragile beginning that had just been born in its wake. Morning unfurled itself in quiet gold. The storm had washed the air clean, leaving the lake smooth as glass and the world touched with a fragile kind of clarity. Mist curled above the water like breath rising from a sleeping body. Inside the Vale estate, everything seemed gentler, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the warmth of what had transpired the night before. Amara stood by the window of her guest house, wrapped in one of Ethan's oversized sweaters. The fabric held his faint scent, cedar, ink, and rain. She pressed her fingertips to the glass and watched sunlight spill across the surface of the lake. Her reflection stared back at her. The same woman, and yet not the same. Something within her had shifted, quietly, irrevocably. For the first time in years, she felt whole. In the main house, Ethan moved through the rooms as though rediscovering them. The air felt different now, charged with something soft and invisible. When he passed the piano, he paused, letting his fingers glide over the keys without playing. The music that had once been an elegy now waited like a promise. He spent the morning in his study, pretending to work, but his thoughts kept straying to her. The warmth of her skin, the way she had looked at him when she whispered, "This feels impossible." It had not been passion that haunted him most, but the tenderness of it, the grace of being known. At noon, Amara crossed the garden with the twins, the stroller wheels whispering over gravel. Margaret met her halfway with a pitcher of lemonade and a knowing smile. "You look lighter, dear," the older woman said, handing her a glass. Amara laughed softly. "Maybe it's the air after the rain, or maybe it's something else." Margaret's eyes gleamed. "There's a look people get when they've been reminded they're alive." Amara didn't answer. She only smiled into her drink, the tartness waking her senses. The truth was too new, too tender to speak aloud. Later that afternoon, while the twins napped, she returned to the garden alone. She had brought with her a handful of flower seeds Margaret had found in the shed, lavender, marigold, and forget-me-not. She knelt in the soil and began to plant them carefully, her hands darkened by earth, her heartbeat unhurried. When Ethan found her there, she was humming softly. "I didn't know you gardened," he said. "I didn't," she replied without looking up. "Not until today." He crouched beside her, watching the way she pressed each seed into the soil, as though setting a wish into the earth. "What are these?" "Lavender for calm," she said. "Marigold for courage. Forget-me-not for memory." "The language of flowers," he murmured. "My mother used to believe in that. She said flowers could say what people were too afraid to." Amara smiled. "Then maybe I'm finally learning to speak it." He watched her in silence, the curve of her mouth, the sunlight tangled in her curls. There was something reverent in the way she moved, unhurried, deliberate, as if she were conversing with the world itself. When she stood, brushing the soil from her hands, he reached out and caught her wrist gently. "You're healing this place," he said. She met his eyes. "Maybe it's healing me too." That evening, the garden carried the scent of new beginnings. The air was warm, threaded with the hum of insects and the soft lap of water against the shore. Amara walked the path toward the main house after putting the twins to bed. She found Ethan in the sunroom, a stack of letters scattered across the table beside him. "What are those?" she asked. He looked up, his expression distant. "Letters I wrote to my mother after she passed. I never sent them, of course, but sometimes writing to her was the only way I knew how to keep her close." Amara hesitated, then took one gently from the pile. His handwriting was elegant, restrained. She read a few lines aloud. "I tried to play today. It didn't sound right without you listening." Her chest tightened. "You've been carrying this alone for too long." He nodded. "I thought grief was something you survived by silence. But lately, I'm not so sure." She folded the letter carefully and set it aside. "Maybe healing isn't about silence. Maybe it's about learning a new language." He tilted his head. "And what language would that be?" "The kind you taught me last night," she said quietly. He looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw both longing and restraint, the delicate balance of a man who had forgotten how to reach, but was beginning to remember. She stepped closer until only inches separated them. The faint light from the lake filtered through the glass, catching in her curls. "You once said music remembers," she whispered. "So do we." He reached out, his hand brushing hers. "Then let's remember something worth keeping." The words hung between them, neither a confession nor a vow, but something truer than either. They stood together, watching as night fell over the lake. The surface caught the last glow of the sun before dimming into silver. Inside, the air hummed with the unspoken. In the days that followed, a quiet rhythm wove itself through their lives. Ethan would leave small gestures in her path: a sprig of lavender on the windowsill, a cup of coffee waiting on her porch, a note folded beneath the twins' blankets that simply read, "You make this house feel alive." Amara responded in her own way. She baked bread in the mornings and left a slice on his desk, still warm. She wrote tiny verses on slips of paper, lines from her grandmother's poems, and tucked them between the pages of his notebooks. Each gesture became a sentence, each exchange a conversation spoken in silence. Margaret noticed, of course. She saw it in the way Ethan's shoulders eased when Amara entered the room, and the way Amara's laughter lingered longer now. But she said nothing. Some things, she knew, bloomed better without interference. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Ethan found Amara standing in the garden again. The first sprouts had begun to appear, small, fragile shoots breaking through the soil. She knelt to touch them, smiling to herself. "They're growing," she whispered. He stood behind her, his voice low. "Everything does when it's given the right care." She turned, her eyes catching his. The moment stretched, tender and weightless. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt no grief, no ache, only a quiet awe. The language between them had grown beyond words, beyond fear. It was in the soil beneath their feet, in the air they shared, in the soft, unspoken promise that healing wasn't something you waited for. It was something you built together. The first whisper of trouble came quietly, like the faint chill before a storm. Summer had settled around the lake house, soft light, long days, the air thick with the scent of lavender and the laughter of two growing children. But beneath the calm, something unseen had begun to stir. Amara sensed it before she understood it. A heaviness in the mornings, an unspoken weight in Ethan's eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. He had grown quieter, distracted. At first she told herself it was work, emails, calls, the endless noise of a company demanding its master's attention. But she knew better. Ethan Vale had never been a man of half-truths, yet something inside him had changed. That change revealed itself one evening when a black sedan appeared at the gate, its presence too sharp, too deliberate against the serenity of the lake. Amara saw it from the garden, the sunlight glinting off its mirror-polished hood. She froze, heart skipping as the driver stepped out, followed by a woman she recognized instantly, though she had never met her. Claire Vale. The name had surfaced only once in conversation. Ethan's careful, almost reluctant mention of a marriage long decayed. The kind of past he didn't dwell on, but couldn't quite erase. Now, standing in her pristine beige coat and dark glasses, Claire was every bit the embodiment of control and precision. "Mrs. Vale," Margaret greeted her at the door, surprise softening into guarded politeness. "Ex-Mrs. Vale," Claire corrected smoothly. "I believe Ethan is expecting me." But he wasn't. When Ethan appeared moments later, the easy calm that had defined his days by the lake vanished. His voice, usually low and warm, grew taut. "Claire, what are you doing here?" Her smile was a blade disguised as grace. "I was in town. I thought we might speak. Privately." Amara, watching from the edge of the garden, saw how his jaw tightened, how the muscles in his shoulders drew in, as if bracing for an impact he'd known was inevitable. She turned away before he could see her, the faint scent of marigolds suddenly sharp in her throat. Inside, the conversation began with civility and ended with something else entirely. "You've been difficult to reach," Claire said, crossing one elegant leg over the other. "The board has questions about your recent absence." "My leave was approved," Ethan replied, his tone even. The company runs without me for a reason. Perhaps, she said, but not well. Investors are restless. They miss the man who could charm a room, not the one hiding in the woods. He exhaled slowly. I'm not hiding, I'm living. Her smile didn't waver. With her, the word hung in the air, heavy with insinuation. Ethan's gaze sharpened. Be careful, Claire. She leaned forward, eyes gleaming. I am being careful. That's why I came. People talk, Ethan. A nurse from the city, 2 children who aren't yours. It doesn't look good, especially for someone whose reputation is built on discipline. He stood abruptly, the movement enough to silence her. You came here to threaten me? To remind you, she said softly, that the world is watching. When she left an hour later, the air in the house felt different, thinner, colder. Amara waited until she heard the car disappear down the long drive before stepping into the entryway. Ethan stood near the window, his reflection fractured in the glass. She came to warn you? Amara asked quietly. She came to control me, he said. It's what she does best. He turned then, meeting her eyes. The exhaustion there startled her. It wasn't just anger, but the weight of years carried too long. I should have told you she'd come eventually. I ended things with her long before I met you, but she's not someone who lets go easily. Amara folded her arms, not out of defense, but to steady herself. She knows about me, yes, and about the twins. His silence was answer enough. Amara took a breath. Then she'll use them. Ethan's eyes darkened. She already has. That night, rain returned to the lake. It came sudden and violent, drumming against the glass like the echo of old ghosts. Ethan sat at the piano but didn't play. Amara stood behind him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Neither spoke. The following days passed with uneasy quiet. Ethan buried himself in calls, in damage control for rumors spreading through the boardroom walls he thought he'd left behind. Amara did her best to keep the house warm, the children laughing, the rhythm of peace intact. But tension lingered in the corners, invisible yet undeniable. Then another message arrived, this time for her. A plain envelope slipped under her door early one morning. No address, no name. Inside, a single sheet of paper. You don't belong there. Walk away before you ruin him too. Her breath caught. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the intent was unmistakable. She folded the note carefully, pressing it to her chest, as though trying to slow her heart. When Ethan found her later, she didn't mention it. He already looked so tired. Instead, she smiled, tucked the paper into a drawer, and told him the garden was blooming. But the shadows were lengthening. A few days later, she received a message on her phone, a number she hadn't seen in months. We need to talk. About the twins. The name beneath it froze her where she stood. Derek, the father of her children. The man she'd run from. The world she had built, this fragile, beautiful piece, swayed under the weight of that single word. She turned toward the window, toward the lake that had become her sanctuary. Beyond the glass, clouds gathered again, heavy and dark. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, Amara understood that healing never comes without consequence. Every wound closed leaves a mark, and every light, no matter how gentle, casts a shadow. The invitation arrived on a Friday afternoon, gilded in silver and heavy with pretense. The Vail Foundation annual charity gala, embossed in looping script. Below it, a note written in Claire's unmistakable handwriting. Attend is expected. The board would appreciate your presence. Ethan read the words twice before setting the card down on his desk. He had spent years hosting such events, rooms filled with polished strangers and hollow praise. But this time, the very thought of returning to that world made his chest ache. Still, he knew what the note meant. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. When Amara found him later that evening, the letter still lay open beside his untouched coffee. Claire? She asked quietly. He nodded. The annual gala. She's using it to remind me where I belong, or where she thinks I do. And will you go? He hesitated. If I don't, she'll paint the absence as guilt. If I do, she'll find another way to turn it into a performance. His eyes met hers then, softening. But I won't go alone. Her pulse quickened. You mean, I want you there, Amara. His tone was calm, but resolute. Not as a secret, not as someone I hide from the world. You and the twins are part of my life now. It's time I stopped letting her decide what that means. For a moment, neither spoke. The lake shimmered outside the window, evening sunlight folding across its surface. Amara felt a slow bloom of fear and pride rise in equal measure. You know she won't take it kindly. I know, he said, but I'm done living kindly for her sake. The night of the gala arrived with an elegance that felt almost cruel. The ballrooms shimmered beneath chandeliers of crystal and light, each table draped in silver silk, each guest polished to perfection. Cameras flashed as luxury cars pulled into the circular drive, laughter echoing over the sound of violins. Amara stepped out of the car, her arm trembling slightly against Ethan's. She wore a gown the color of midnight, its satin fabric catching every glint of light. Her hair, swept into soft curls, brushed against a slender chain of gold he had given her that morning. You look, Ethan paused, unable to find a word that fit. Like something the world doesn't deserve. She smiled faintly, though her heart raced. Then let's hope the world disagrees. Inside, the music swelled. Claire's voice carried above the chatter as she greeted guests with impeccable charm. She was radiant in ivory silk, a diamond brooch glinting at her collarbone, a queen surveying her court. When she saw Ethan, her smile did not falter, but her eyes flickered with ice. Ethan, she said smoothly, extending a hand. You made it. He took it briefly. You said attendance was expected. Her gaze slid past him, settling on Amara. The pause was slight, but deliberate. And who is this? This is Amara Lewis, Ethan said before she could finish the question. His voice was steady. She's with me. The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. A few nearby guests turned, curiosity rippling through the crowd. Claire's smile deepened, sweet, venomous. Of course, she said. Welcome, Ms. Lewis. I do hope you enjoy the evening. Amara inclined her head, her composure flawless. Thank you, Mrs. Vale. Your home is beautiful. Claire's eyes flickered, the briefest crack in her mask. It was, she said. Once. The orchestra began a new piece, and the tension eased, though only on the surface. Ethan led Amara toward the far end of the room, where the lights were dimmer and the air less thick with polite cruelty. He leaned close. You don't have to stay long, just enough to remind them I'm still human. She smiled softly. And to remind her you're no longer hers. For a while, the evening unfolded with deceptive grace. Toasts were made, speeches delivered, laughter rehearsed. Ethan played his part well, measured, charming, untouchable. Amara stood beside him, radiant but calm, her presence grounding him in ways no crowd could. Yet even peace, however fragile, has a time limit. The sound of glass breaking drew their attention toward the entrance. A man stood there, tall, his expression taut with anger and something darker, recognition. Derek, Amara whispered, her breath catching. He hadn't changed much. The same sharp jaw, the same arrogance that once disguised weakness. But now his eyes gleamed with the thrill of vengeance. What is he doing here? Ethan murmured, stepping slightly in front of her. Before Amara could answer, Claire's voice rose, smooth and carrying. Ah, Mr. Harris, I'm so glad you could join us. Derek smirked, the gesture sharp as glass. Wouldn't miss it for the world, especially after hearing such fascinating things about tonight's guest of honor. His gaze swept toward Amara. You didn't think you could hide forever, did you? The room fell into a hush. Every eye turned toward them. Amara felt her pulse in her throat. This isn't the place, she said, her voice trembling but firm. Oh, I think it's exactly the place, Derek said. You see, Ethan Vale here has been playing the saint, saving the poor nurse, rescuing her and her precious twins. But what he didn't tell you all is that those twins aren't his. They're mine. The words landed like thunder. Gasps rippled through the crowd, whispers rising in their wake. Claire stood motionless, her expression unreadable, though satisfaction shimmered faintly behind her eyes. Ethan's voice, when it came, was low and steady. "You're finished, Derek. Leave now before you regret it." "Regret?" Derek laughed. "No, Ethan. Regret is yours. For thinking you could replace me. For thinking you could buy yourself a family." Amara stepped forward, shaking but unyielding. "You forfeited that family the moment you walked away." For the first time, Derek faltered. Her voice was calm, clear, cutting through the noise like a bell. "You left because love was too heavy for you to carry. Don't come here pretending it's yours to reclaim." The crowd held its breath. Somewhere in the silence, someone applauded. A single, hesitant clap that broke the tension. Claire's gaze darted toward the sound, fury flickering beneath her perfect smile. Ethan reached for Amara's hand, his grip firm. "We're done here." He led her through the murmuring crowd, past the stunned faces, and the flash of cameras eager for scandal. Outside, rain had begun again, fine and cold against their skin. They stopped beneath the awning, neither speaking for a long moment. The air between them trembled with everything that had just fractured, their peace, their anonymity, their fragile refuge by the lake. Ethan turned to her, his voice rough. "I'm sorry." She shook her head, tears cutting silent paths down her cheeks. "No, we both knew the past would find us. We just didn't know it would wear such familiar faces." Thunder rolled over the city. Behind them, the gala continued, a world of masks and laughter resuming its hollow performance. But outside, beneath the honest rain, two people stood stripped of illusion, their love no longer hidden, and the war they had both been trying to avoid, finally at their door. The morning after the gala was painfully still. The world outside the lake house gleamed under a pale, cold sun, its light sharp enough to expose everything that had broken the night before. The air carried the brittle quiet of aftermath, too calm, too deliberate, like the deep breath taken before grief begins to speak. Ethan sat in the study, surrounded by the ghosts of headlines. His name was everywhere. Tech visionary in scandal. Charity gala erupts in family drama. Who is the woman beside Ethan Vale? He didn't need to read them. He knew the rhythm of ruin too well. The media had always loved him when he was untouchable. Now that he'd become human, they loved him more. For the fall, Margaret found him there, coffee cooling untouched beside him, his tie discarded, sleeves rolled up. "You've been sitting in that chair since dawn," she said gently. "I'm calculating damage," he murmured without looking up. "Damage isn't always measured in numbers." He glanced at her then, exhaustion etched deep beneath his eyes. "Tell that to the board. They called already. 3 of them want to suspend my position until the situation resolves itself." "And what exactly is the situation?" she asked softly. He hesitated. "A woman I love, a man who hates me, and a truth I should have been braver about." Upstairs, Amara moved through the nursery with quiet precision. The twins were restless, unsettled by the energy that lingered in the air. She sang to them softly, her voice trembling but steady enough to calm their breathing. Yet even as she rocked them, her mind replayed every moment from the night before. The gasps, the whispers, the cameras capturing her pain like art. When she finally laid them down to sleep, she stood for a long time by the window. The reflection staring back at her looked fragile, almost translucent. For years, she had fought to build a life beyond the man who once controlled her, beyond the scars he'd left behind. And now, with a few cruel words, Derek had dragged her back into the very fire she'd escaped. A soft knock came at the door. Ethan entered quietly, his voice low. "You should rest." "I can't," she said, not turning. "It's too loud in here." He stepped closer, his presence warm, familiar. "Then let me quiet it." She turned to face him, and for the first time since the gala, their eyes met without pretense. "You didn't deserve that, Ethan." "Neither did you," he said, He used you to wound me, and I let it happen. No, she whispered. You didn't. We both walked into that room knowing the past doesn't forgive easily. He looked at her, this woman who had survived everything and still found the strength to offer grace. I should have protected you better. You can't protect me from the truth, she said gently. You can only stand beside me when it comes. They fell into silence then, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. The only sound was the wind brushing against the windows, the faint sigh of the house trying to hold them together. When Amara finally spoke again, her voice was barely audible. Derek won't stop. You know that. I do, Ethan said. But he also doesn't realize what he's started. Her brow furrowed. What do you mean? Ethan walked to the window, staring out at the lake, its surface rippling under a restless breeze. For years, I built my life on control. Every move calculated, every weakness hidden. But last night, they saw something real. And the thing about truth is, it doesn't just destroy reputations. It rebuilds them too. She stepped closer, watching the light play across his face. You still believe in rebuilding after all this? He turned to her then, eyes steady. I believe in us. But belief alone could not silence the noise. Within days, journalists appeared at the edge of the property, their cameras glinting like insects in the sun. Drones hovered above the trees. Every movement became spectacle. Margaret moved through the chaos like a quiet guardian, ushering deliveries to the back door, screening calls. But even she couldn't keep the whispers from slipping through. When one article called Amara a mistress who found refuge in scandal, Ethan slammed his fist against the wall. The crack in the plaster felt symbolic, an outward fracture mirroring the one inside him. That night, Amara found him in the music room, hands braced on the piano, breath ragged. Ethan, he shook his head. I thought I could control the narrative. I thought I could outthink it, outspin it. But they're not after truth. They're after blood. She stepped forward, placing her hand over his. Then don't give them ours. He looked at her, a flicker of something breaking through the despair. How are you still this calm? Because I've lived through worse storms, she said quietly, and because I'm not afraid of the world knowing who I am anymore. I won't hide my children. I won't hide us. Her words settled deep within him, steady, unshakable. Then we do it your way, he said finally. No statements, no denial, just truth. The next morning, Ethan issued a brief letter to the press. No embellishment, no defense. Amara Lewis and her children are part of my life. What happened at the gala was personal, and I intend to keep it that way. Some stories belong to the people living them, not the ones profiting from their pain. The simplicity of it disarmed everyone. The noise didn't vanish, but it dulled. And for the first time in days, the house began to breathe again. Still, the quiet brought its own ache. The twins caught colds from the constant rain, and Amara barely slept, tending to their fevers through the night. Ethan often woke to the sound of her lullabies drifting through the hallways. Soft, exhausted, beautiful. Sometimes he'd stand in the doorway, watching her hair falling loose, her eyes shadowed but alive. In those moments, he realized love wasn't something you declared in grand gestures. It was in the quiet persistence of showing up when the world refused to make space for peace. By the end of the week, the headlines began to fade. The world, as it always did, found new scandals to feed on. Yet something between them had changed. Not broken, but deepened. Ethan found her one evening on the porch, the twins asleep at last. The lake reflected the last streaks of sunset, the world washed in amber and gold. He sat beside her, their shoulders touching. We survived it, he said softly. For now, she replied, but surviving isn't the same as healing. He nodded, understanding. Then we'll keep learning how. They sat in silence as the sun dipped below the trees, the air cooling around them. Beneath the stillness, the faint sounds of life continued. Water against the dock, crickets in the reeds, the steady rhythm of breathing shared between two souls who had been burned, broken, and still found their way back to warmth. The world might have called it fallout, but to them it was simply what remained after the fire, and the fragile, flickering proof that something beautiful had survived the ruin. The summons arrived in a thick envelope, stamped and sealed in cruel perfection. Amara didn't need to open it to know what it was. The weight of it alone carried a kind of finality, the weight of a man who wanted control, not reconciliation. Petition for custody. The words printed across the top blurred as she read them. Beneath them, Derek's name, bold, confident, signed in ink that looked almost triumphant. Her hands trembled, not with surprise, but with exhaustion. She had feared this moment for years, ever since the night she fled with 2 tiny lives wrapped in blankets and silence. Ethan found her standing by the kitchen window, the letter clutched to her chest, sunlight catching the moisture in her eyes. "What happened?" he asked softly, though he already knew. She handed him the papers wordlessly. He read them once, his jaw tightening, then again, slower, his fingers curling around the edges until the paper creased. "He's petitioning for full custody," she whispered, "claiming I'm unfit, that I've exposed the twins to a dangerous environment." Ethan looked up sharply. "Dangerous?" "He means you," she said, voice breaking. "The headlines, the cameras, the chaos. He's going to argue that living here, living with you, puts them at risk." For a long time there was only the sound of the lake outside, the faint hum of insects in the late afternoon. Then Ethan exhaled, the sound heavy and quiet. "He's trying to destroy you to hurt me." "No," she said. "He's trying to win. That's what men like him do. They mistake destruction for victory." She sank into a chair, the strength leaving her. "He has money now, influence. His new wife runs a foundation. They'll make him look respectable. And me?" She gave a broken laugh. "I'm the woman who walked out, the one who ran." Ethan knelt beside her, his hand finding hers. "You didn't run. You saved your children. But will a judge see it that way?" He hesitated, the truth pressing against his ribs. "We'll make them see." The days that followed became a blur of meetings, phone calls, and sleepless nights. Ethan's legal team descended upon the lake house like soldiers preparing for battle. Documents filled the dining table, affidavits and depositions stacked beside empty coffee cups. Amara moved through it all in a daze. Every word written about her life felt like a dissection. Her choices turned into arguments, her strength twisted into suspicion. Each line of the custody petition was another knife. Derek's lawyers painted her as unstable, claiming emotional distress, citing her dependence on an inappropriate relationship. They described Ethan as a manipulative figure who had taken advantage of her vulnerability. The cruelty of it made her physically ill. Late one night, after everyone else had gone, Ethan found her sitting on the floor of the twins' room, her arms around herself, her eyes fixed on their sleeping faces. "Tell me what to do," he said quietly. "Make it stop," she whispered. "Please, just make it stop." He knelt beside her. "I can't stop him, Amara, but I can fight him, and I will." She turned toward him, her voice trembling. "What if he wins?" "Then we start again," he said, his voice firm despite the fear in it. "I'll follow you anywhere, but he won't win." He didn't say it out of arrogance, but conviction, the kind that grows only from love forged in fire. The first hearing was held in the city courthouse, a world away from the quiet safety of the lake. The room smelled of paper and cold air, its light too white, its silence too sharp. Derek sat across from them in an expensive suit, every inch the image of composure. His wife, Vanessa, sat beside him, her expression a mask of sympathy that fooled no one. When Amara entered, holding Ethan's hand, the tension in the room shifted. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but their absence didn't make the stares less invasive. The judge, a woman with kind eyes but an unyielding voice, listened as the attorneys began. Derek's lawyer spoke first, his tone oiled and polished. He spoke of concern for the children's stability, of a mother's compromised judgment. He painted Ethan as a public liability, a man surrounded by controversy and scandal. Ethan's lawyer countered with quiet precision. He spoke of Amara's service as a nurse, her devotion, the years she had raised the twins alone. He spoke of Derek's absence, his negligence, the years of silence followed only by sudden ambition. Through it all, Amara sat still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. But when the judge finally asked if she wished to speak, she rose. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke. "Your Honor," she said, "I don't have wealth or influence. What I have are two children who know they are loved every single day. I don't want to take them from their father. I only want to protect them from being used." She turned briefly toward Derek. He walked away when they were barely breathing. He returns now because he sees something worth owning. But children aren't trophies. They're not proof of victory. They're lives. The room was silent. Even Derek shifted uncomfortably, his confidence faltering under the weight of her words. When the hearing adjourned, the judge made no ruling, only promising a second session in 2 weeks. But as they left the courtroom, Amara's legs felt weak, her body drained. Ethan guided her to the car, his arms steady around her shoulders. "You were incredible," he murmured. "I was terrified," she said. "But maybe fear isn't the opposite of strength. Maybe it's part of it." He smiled faintly. "Then you're the strongest person I know." The war stretched on. Every day brought new letters, new accusations, new photographs dredged from the past. The media, starved for drama, devoured every rumor. The lake house, once a sanctuary, became a fortress under siege. But amid the chaos, something unbreakable grew between them. Late nights spent preparing testimony turned into whispered confessions of resilience. Each small victory, a motion denied, a witness discredited, felt like another breath returned. And through it all, the twins remained untouched by the noise. They played, laughed, and reached for their mother's hands, their innocence an anchor to something pure. One evening, as the sun melted behind the hills, Amara stood by the water with Ethan beside her. The reflection of the lake shimmered around them, alive and uncertain. "Do you ever wonder how long we can keep fighting?" she asked softly. Ethan looked out at the horizon. "Until there's nothing left to fight for." She turned toward him, eyes luminous in the fading light. "And if we lose?" He reached for her hand. "Then we'll love them louder. No court can take that from us." The wind stirred, carrying the scent of rain. Amara closed her eyes, feeling the ache and the courage tangled within the same breath. The war was far from over, but for the first time since the papers arrived, she realized something profound. Love was not only her defense, it was her weapon. And no decree, no headline, no courtroom could ever silence the language of a mother's heart. The night the fire came, the air had been too still, one of those heavy, waiting silences that precede disaster. The lake glimmered beneath a pale half-moon, the stars smudged behind clouds that refused to move. Inside the house, Amara tucked the twins into bed, her movements slow from the exhaustion that had settled into her bones after weeks of hearings and sleeplessness. Ethan was in his study, the light from his desk lamp spilling over papers that no longer seemed to matter. His eyes kept drifting toward the window, toward the faint shimmer of the garden below. The lavender and marigold now full-grown, their scent carried faintly through the open door. He had built a life around control, but lately it had slipped from his hands like sand through glass. The court case had taken everything from them: time, peace, and faith in the world's fairness. Every day was a new argument, a new demand from Derek's lawyers, a new headline dissecting their love as if it were a crime. Yet through it all they had endured together, until that night. It began with a smell, sharp, acrid, alien. Amara stirred in her sleep, her mind fogged with dreams. Then came the sound, a crack, a low groan, like the house itself was in pain. She sat up. Smoke curled beneath the bedroom door. Her body reacted before her mind did. She ran to the twins' room, pulling them from their beds, wrapping them in blankets, her breath catching on the bitter air. "Ethan!" she screamed, the word torn from her throat. Downstairs, Ethan had already seen the glow through the window, the orange reflection rising against the dark. He threw open the door to the hallway, the heat hitting him like a wave. "Amara! In here!" she cried. He found her by the stairs, clutching both children, her eyes wide and wild. The fire had spread fast, too fast. The curtains had gone up like paper. The wooden beams were cracking, spitting sparks. The house that had held their healing was now turning against them. He tore off his jacket, wrapped it around her shoulders. "We have to go. Now," she hesitated, looking back toward the nursery. "They're things." "Forget the things," he said, voice breaking. "We just need you." They pushed through the smoke together, the twins pressed between them, coughing, crying. The front door was only a few meters away, but the air was thick, choking. Flames crawled up the walls, licking at the staircase. Ethan shielded Amara with his body, leading her toward the door. Then came the explosion, small, but enough to shake the ground beneath their feet. A gas line, perhaps, or a fuse from the generator. The impact threw them apart. Amara fell hard against the floor, one arm tightening around the twins, the other reaching out blindly. "Ethan!" He coughed, disoriented, searching through the smoke. "Go! Get out!" "I'm not leaving you." He could barely see her now, just the outline of her face through the orange haze. "Amara, please, take them." Her heart splintered, but instinct overruled. She pulled herself to her feet, clutching the twins, and stumbled toward the open air. The cool night struck her lungs like ice. Behind her, the house roared, a living thing in its death throes. She turned back once, screaming his name again, and then she saw him, silhouetted in the doorway, coughing, stumbling forward, flames framing him like some broken saint. He made it 3 steps before the ceiling gave way. The crash was deafening. A wall of fire swallowed the space where he'd stood. Amara screamed, running toward the door, but strong arms caught her. Margaret, her face streaked with soot, her hands trembling, dragged her back. "No!" Amara sobbed. "He's still in there. Amara, you can't." "I won't leave him." But the fire was too fierce now, the roof collapsing in a rain of sparks. The night filled with the terrible music of destruction. Wood snapping, glass shattering, the sound of everything they had built turning to ash. She fell to her knees, clutching the twins to her chest, her cries lost in the roar. The firefighters arrived minutes later, though time had lost meaning. They moved through the smoke like ghosts, shouting orders, dragging hoses, their faces hidden behind masks. Someone led her away, wrapped her in a blanket, but she felt nothing. Her eyes stayed locked on the house, their house, as flames consumed it whole. Hours passed before the fire was finally beaten down to embers. Dawn crept over the lake, pale and merciless. The water reflected the ruins, a skeleton of beams, smoke rising in delicate threads. One of the firefighters approached her carefully. "Ma'am," he said softly, "we found him." Her breath stopped. "He was near the study," the man continued. "Looks like he tried to get something out." Something. She rose unsteadily, her body numb, her voice no more than a whisper. "Show me." They led her to the edge of the wreckage. The air still stank of smoke and wet ash. Amid the blackened ruins of the study, a shape lay covered by a blanket. Her hands shook as she reached down, but she couldn't bring herself to lift it. Beside him, half-charred but intact, lay a leather-bound book. The journal he kept on his mother's piano. She picked it up, her fingers blackened by soot. The first page was burned away, but the last words survived. If love survives the fire, then it was never fragile. Amara pressed the book to her chest, her body shaking as the sun rose behind her. By morning, the world would know. News vans already lined the road, vultures circling grief, but she didn't see them. Her world had narrowed to the steady rhythm of the twins breathing against her shoulder, the weight of the journal in her hands, and the echo of Ethan's voice still alive inside her. He had gone into the flames not to save himself, but to save something that meant more to him than life itself. The proof that their love had existed, that it had changed him, that it had been real. The lake was still. Smoke drifted over the water, ghostly, almost beautiful. Amara stood there until the sun broke fully over the trees, painting gold across the ruins. And though she could not yet move, could not yet speak, she felt something in her heart refuse to die. Love, she thought, was not a fragile thing. It burned, it endured, and even when all else turned to ash, it remained, a quiet, unyielding flame within the ruin. Morning returned slowly, like a hesitant guest uncertain of its welcome. The lake was silent once more, wrapped in the soft hush that follows both storm and sorrow. Mist drifted over the water in thin, tender veils. Where the house had once stood, grand, bright, alive, there was now only a foundation kissed by dew, a memory carved into ash and earth. Amara stood at the edge of the ruins, her figure still and graceful against the rising light. Her hands clutched a single lily, white, unblemished, trembling slightly in the breeze. Behind her, the twins played quietly in the grass, their laughter faint and bright, like bells in the distance. Months had passed since the fire. The newspapers had faded, the noise had stilled. The court, in the end, had dismissed Derek's case, his cruelty exposed, his motives laid bare. He had vanished from their lives once more, leaving nothing behind but the faint echo of a man who mistook possession for love. The world had moved on, as it always did, but for Amara, time did not erase, it softened. It gave shape to absence, to the space Ethan had once filled. In the quiet moments, when the twins slept and the lake shimmered beneath the moon, she still felt him there, not as a wound, but as warmth. She had rebuilt. Not the house, not yet, but the life within it. Margaret had stayed with her, grounding her in the small rituals of living, morning tea, tending the garden that somehow grew again from the scorched soil. Amara had planted lavender first, then marigolds, and finally forget-me-nots. When they bloomed, their colors mirrored the memory of Ethan's gaze, gentle, unguarded, full of unspoken promise. One evening, as she was cleaning what remained of the old piano, she found something hidden beneath the soot, a small flash drive sealed in a metal case. Her breath caught. She hadn't known he'd kept anything digital. Ethan had always preferred ink and paper. She brought it inside, plugged it into her laptop, and waited as the screen flickered to life. There was one folder, one file. For Amara. She opened it, and music filled the room. It was his composition, the piece he had played the night they first danced. But now it was complete, layered, full, heartbreakingly beautiful. Beneath the melody, his voice came, low and steady, the recording faint but clear. If you're hearing this, it means the fire took what I couldn't protect. But I want you to know, it didn't take everything. You taught me that love isn't something we keep, it's something we give. You gave it freely, even when I didn't believe I deserved it. I used to think creation meant building something perfect, but you showed me it means building something true. When you play this, remember, you were my beginning, not my end. Her tears fell silently as the piano swelled, the music filling every corner of the house that was no longer there. She closed her eyes and listened, her hands trembling against the keyboard. It was as if he had come back for one final conversation, not with words, but with sound. That night, she wrote. She wrote about grief and beauty, about loss that does not consume but transforms. She wrote about a man who believed he couldn't create life, and a woman who taught him that love was creation itself. The story flowed from her in waves, carrying both pain and peace. Months later, the manuscript became a book. She titled it The Language of Light. It wasn't a story about tragedy, but about rebirth, the way love, even when broken by fire, could still find its way through ash. The world received it quietly at first, then fiercely. Letters began to arrive from strangers who saw themselves in her pages. Widows, dreamers, mothers, men who had forgotten how to hope. And through it all, she felt him there, Ethan Vale, not as memory but as presence. In the way the wind stirred through the reeds, in the laughter of their children, in the low hum of the earth that never stopped singing. One spring morning, as dawn stretched its pale arms across the lake, Amara took the twins down to the water. The air was fresh, washed clean by the night's rain. They released paper lanterns into the breeze, one for him, one for his mother, one for the life they had built together. The lanterns floated higher and higher until they became stars of their own, vanishing into the gold-lit clouds. The twins turned to her, their eyes the color of the lake after rain. "Mama," the little boy asked softly, "do you think Daddy can see us?" She smiled, her heart steady. "He doesn't have to see us," she whispered. "He's in everything that shines." The sun rose fully then, spilling light across the water, across the garden that had bloomed again from ruin. And for the first time since that terrible night, Amara felt no ache, only the fullness of a love that had learned to exist beyond the boundaries of flesh and time. She looked toward the horizon, the light warming her face, and whispered to the wind, "We made it, Ethan. We kept the fire alive." And somewhere deep in her chest, she swore she heard a single piano note answer her. Soft, clear, infinite. When the world takes from us, it also gives. The chance to rebuild, to love again, to write a new melody from the ashes of the old. If you've ever lost, if you've ever stood in the quiet aftermath of your own fire, know this. Love is not gone. It's only changing shape, waiting for you to see it in another form. If this story touched your heart, let it live a little longer. Share it, speak it, carry it forward. And if you, too, believe that love can survive the fire, stay a while. There are more stories to tell and dawns yet to rise.